Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amber Cote. I'm the Director of Community and Volunteers with Rocky Mountain Public Media, and we're so happy to have you here in our space. I'm just curious, can I get a show of hands for anyone who's been here before? Nice, nice. Well, for all of you who have not been here before, we welcome you to the Buell Center for Public Media, and we welcome you back again. We have lots of events here. This is a partnership with Opera Colorado and Rocky Mountain Public Media. We're having a discussion on the riddle of Turandot. And I've already introduced myself, so I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. Harry?
Hi, everybody. My name is Harry Buddhisiddhartha. I am Executive Director of Asian Pacific Development Center, and I'm glad to be here to have this important discussion with all of you.
I'm Greg Carpenter. I'm the General and Artistic Director of Opera Colorado.
Hi, my name is Arya Umazawa. I am a stage director, and specifically I'll be stage directing the upcoming Opera Colorado production of Turandot.
Hi, I'm Margaret Ozaki Graves. You can call me Meg. I work as a freelance performer in opera, and I also work in education and community engagement at a local opera company called Central City Opera.
Hi, everyone. My name is Deborah Yim, and I am the founder and managing attorney of the Primera Law Group. We're a Denver-based law firm specializing in labor and employment and civil rights law. And I'm also the president-elect of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association, Colorado.
Thank you all. So before we get started with our panel discussion, we're going to look at a trailer from Lyric Opera of Chicago that will show the sets, not costumes, for the Opera Colorado production in May, and everyone will get a chance to hear some of the music. So tell us about Turandot. A little about the story, the composer, when it was composed, the music. Arya and Greg.
Yes, actually, Greg, would you like to start? Because I feel like you're a veritable encyclopedia entry on this opera.
I wouldn't say that I'm an encyclopedia on anything. I will say I sang this opera on that set in 1988, 30-some years ago. Puccini, if you look at the Italian composers and kind of look across the spectrum of the operas that are being performed by Italian composers in Italian, it is Rossini, Verdi, and Puccini, and probably Puccini more often than any of those other two. Partly because he wrote a lot of great works, Bohème, Butterfly, Tosca is another great opera that he wrote that gets performed a lot, and then Turandot. He's got some other ones that get performed a little less often, Fanciulla del West or The Golden Girl of the West, but he is this composer that is very much been part of Western culture, and particularly he had two operas that were premiered, or actually Fanciulla was premiered at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City before it ever premiered in Italy or anyplace else. So there's this identification with this great composer. He's known for what we call verismo opera. Verismo in Italian means truth or reality. And it was a movement that came after Verdi about presenting stories that were about everyday life in a community. And so when you think about a couple of the composers that were just before him or contemporaries, Leoncavallo, and like Pagliacci or Cavalleria Rusticana, they're about families and things that are happening in a little Italian village and so forth. And so a lot of what I think people really gravitated to Puccini initially around was this fact that they were slices of life, particularly his early and middle operas. I think when we get to Turandot and Butterfly and so forth, he had just had we were just talking about this before we started tonight. He was in an awful car accident where both his wife and son were thrown from the car. He was thrown from the car and the car landed on top of him. His driver was injured. Nobody was killed in the accident, but you have to believe that that was a life-changing experience for him and his family. And so the operas that come after that suddenly turn more into fantasy on some level, or he starts looking at subject matter that was exotic to him. And I'm sure that came to him through stories or photographs or whatever mode of communication that he could get his hands on. And then he dreamed, you might say, what those stories would be in music. And so that's where we get Madama Butterfly, we get Fanciulla del West. He came to the United States twice, but had never been to the West. But he created this opera that was his image, or what he thought was the West. And we actually credit him to a certain degree with the origination of the spaghetti Western. And then, then comes Turandot, his final opera, which maybe is the biggest fantasy, you might say, of them all, or to a certain degree, the biggest distortion of reality in many ways. But yet the music that he creates gives us the sense that there's a reality to this situation. It pulls at our heart. It makes us lean in instead of sit back in so many ways. And without going into a bunch of history about Puccini, which none of us you can look up online nowadays, but I think that is part for me of what audiences kind of resonates with audiences, is this sense that his music somehow reaches inside of us and pulls us forward. While the stories nowadays are more challenging, there's no question about that. But there are Puccini operas where the stories are very relevant. We just had a DEI committee meeting before I came here of the company, and we talked about Tosca as being, police brutality and Me Too movement. And, we're dealing with the same things today that he was actually conveying in his operas. And I think, again, that's another reason why it still is popular today, and we still somehow connect with it today.
Well put, Greg. I'm sensitive to the time and that we want to get to the rest of our panelists, but that's a great foundation, unless you want like a Cliff's Note.
I'd love to hear a little bit from you as well.
A Cliff Note synopsis of the piece is this is about a princess in a imagined and fictitious place referred to as Peking, I believe, in the libretto. And she has put a condition on being wedded. She says, anybody who would like to marry me has to answer 3 riddles. And if they get even one of them wrong, they're beheaded. And one day a prince shows up and espies her from afar and falls in love and rings the gong, signaling that he would like to try his hand at answering these 3 riddles. He successfully does so. sees that she is distraught and says, I'll issue you my own challenge. If you can guess my name before sunrise, then you can behead me. And if not, you must marry me. And then a search ensues. She is ultimately unsuccessful in discovering his name, but he takes pity on her and gives her his name of his own volition. And then it ends with her declaring publicly that she has discovered his name is love, and then a very triumphant ending to the story. It should be noted that Puccini did not write the ending of this opera. He died before it was completed, so we can get into that debate later, I think, on how that ending plays out, but that's the Cliff Notes version for sure.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So now that we know a little bit about Turandot, let's dive in the issues surrounding this opera regarding Asian representation and stereotypes. Arya, you have a lot of experience in educating audiences about this. So can you summarize for us?
Yeah, so I think contemporary discourse around this opera sort of breaks into two categories. The first is on the opera itself. So as we've sort of alluded to and touched on, this opera is an example of late 19th century, early 20th century Orientalism. It was a movement that was sweeping Europe at the time. And coupled with that, there is the issue of cultural appropriation. So Puccini never went to China, never visited Japan. He took these tunes and tonalities that he uses and didn't really understand what they were used for and sort of applied them to his own purposes. And in doing so, he reduced an entire culture to sort of its aesthetic value. And then on the other hand, more contemporary discourse focuses on the use of yellow face and whitewash casting in the opera. So the yellow face would be, there's sort of a range on what people describe as yellow face, but most people will now describe it as anything that would allow a person not of Asian descent to portray an Asian character. So this could be makeup, this could be costumes, this could be how they are directed to move, but it is anything that would allow a person not of Asian descent to portray an Asian person. And one of the reasons why this is very problematic is because I think it has been used throughout history both to mock Asian cultures as well as to prevent Asian artists from accessing opportunities to participate in art that is ultimately about their cultures and heritage. So it's not an issue really to be taken lightly. It's quite serious, I think. And it's something that in opera in particular continues to happen, not just here in Colorado, but really all over the industry.
Thank you. Tell us about Opera Colorado's production, the one coming up. What will it look like? Who is in the cast?
Do you want to address the look?
Why don't you start with the cast first?
Sure. Casting. We, even our board of directors, we talk a lot about how we cast any opera, whether it's this opera or a Verdi opera. And there is a process to that. It starts off with determining what you want to do. We have a 5-year plan on what we want to cast ultimately. And it's putting, you might say, the APB out to about 35 to 40 agents that some reside in New York, some are in Canada, some are in Europe and the UK, and let them know that we're going to be in New York. We are going to be casting these specific roles. And typically at the same time as we inform them, we have already done our homework, looked at their rosters, and are making suggestions to them of who we would like to hear in those auditions. And then also soliciting back from them not only the availability of those artists that we are interested in hearing, but also soliciting back their recommendations of artists that we may not be aware of. And then we have to call that, and obviously we can't hear every artist in a 2 or 3 day period. Typically, we can be there every other year for 3 days and hear 140, 150 artists in that period of time singing for those specific roles. That is a pretty standard process for most opera companies that go to New York and do a set of auditions. What becomes very subjective is what people listen for. Everybody has a different ear for different things. Everybody has a different sensibility about what they think is a great singer or the best singer or the best tone quality or any of those subtleties of the art form, the art of singing. And so I can tell you that the first thing that Ari Pelter, our music director, and I listen for when we're in the room is just the basic quality of the voice, the clarity of the voice, the beauty of the voice, the evenness top to bottom. There doesn't seem like anybody's struggling to get anywhere within their voice. The second thing we listen for is style. Do they understand Puccini style versus Mozart, the style of singing Mozart, or early music, Monteverdi, or even more contemporary things that tend to be more declamatory than they are legato or lyric, I would say. So we really focus on that. The next thing is the language. Is there facility with pronouncing Italian or German or French or any of the languages that opera exists in? Is there a clarity to that, a correctness to that? And then I would say the last thing is do they understand the language? Are they steeped in it enough to convey the drama of that aria they're singing or the broader sense of the piece? Those are the kind of four key things. And I will say rarely do you hear a singer that has equal measures of all four of those things. But you're trying to really get the best of those four things, or three out of the four, or in order to begin to select a potential cast. And that's basically how we've cast Turandot, for instance. We spread the net wide, and we hope the best come to New York. Or we also do, once a year, we do what we call house auditions. Those are auditions right here at the Opera House. So if some of those singers can get here to Denver, we welcome them that way as well. But that's basically how we cast an opera, any opera.
And so I guess I'll just jump in and say, I was I'll just say I was brought on after this show had been cast, and I think there's sort of no two ways about it. The cast does not features one Asian singer in a supporting role. The rest of them are not. And so in terms of how they will look on stage, this is sort of an ongoing conversation between Opera Colorado and myself in terms of what does a meaningful intervention into this piece look like for the costumes, the messaging, the framing of how we're presenting this piece, and depending on what level of definition of yellow face you adopt personally, my personal view is that there's no two ways about it. There will be some version of yellow face on stage during this production, and so my hope is that it doesn't go unacknowledged or unaddressed in the context of the production.
I will also say that we did cast 3 members of the AAIP community, 2 of which, after they received their contract, took work elsewhere. And then we were scrambling to then find artists to fill those positions.
I'd also just like to hear reactions from the rest of the panel to what you just heard.
No, I think it's really amazing that we're having this conversation. I think to see an opera that is based about China, but not to have any Chinese cast members or any Asian cast members is a little jarring. But I think it's important that we're having this dialogue, we're having this discussion, and addressing some of the stereotypes and the generalizations. It's interesting that I think Puccini wrote this in the 1920s, and now more than 100 years later, we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues. As an attorney, I have clients, Asian American clients, who facing these same stereotypical issues in the workplace. I have children who are facing the same things. I think that it seeps into mainstream And I think it's important to just have that dialogue and to have that awareness.
Well, as an Asian identifying person working in opera, the idea of yellowface or the reality of working in yellowface productions is just something that I have had to deal with since my very first staged production, which was a production of The Mikado. And for me, you know, I've come to terms with what that means for me as an artist, how I can bring my authentic self to all of my work, and whether or not I can bring artistry and my authentic self to some of these historic operatic and operetta works. What I'm interested in knowing is, you know, how can these works exist in 2023 and be welcoming towards members of my community and other Asian identifying communities?
Yeah, and I want to piggyback on what Meg says too, in that, and also what Aria said as well, in that we often talk about Turandot, that it's a fantasy, that Puccini came up with this as a fantasy. But, you know, yes, he never visited China. But keep in mind, the play was written in 1924. By that point, China had been colonized by foreign power for over 100 years. It's not like as if this is the first time that China has been introduced to the West. Nobody has any idea what's going on. I mean, the Opium War happened in 1839. The Chinese coolie trade happened in 1840. In America, by 1924, we already had Chinese Exclusion Act. We had multiple Chinatowns burned down, including in Colorado. So, you know, I don't think, you know, yes, it's always difficult to judge old play based on modern standard. But we also have to acknowledge that when this play was written, there's already a lot of stereotypes about Chinese and Asian community floating around in the community. And this play is certainly not immune to those stereotypes and the racism and sexism of its day.
Thank you all. So what are the broader impacts of misrepresentation? How do the themes in Turandot impact us today? Let's just go into the hard ones now.
I think if I might borrow from some of my Indigenous colleagues in Canada, where there is a large discussion about truth and reconciliation and our responsibility, I think one of the things that's very true about the work that we do is that the stories we tell are very important. We as storytellers have, I think, a very important job in contextualizing the world around us and framing how we understand ourselves and building empathy and all of those things. And I was given this phrase by a beautiful, wonderful colleague of mine, Rebecca Haas of Métis descent, and she said, "What we say is nothing about us without us." And so to be a responsible storyteller, I think one of the things that certainly is a focus on Turandot is that this story is often told without us, and certainly has been for a long time. And so it's a matter of whether or not our communities are able to tell stories that accurately reflect their experiences, whether we can make people feel seen and understood. And I think that's a lot of what goes into the impact of Turandot, is this missed opportunity to engage authentically with, in this case, the Chinese culture and community. And for things like Madame Butterfly, certainly I wrestle with how we engage with the Japanese community, the Nikkei community, which is my community. So I think that's one of the impacts, is just this missed opportunity for authentic and meaningful communication and dialogue.
Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share, Meg?
Well, yeah, I think it would be, well, one thought that comes to mind is the fact that in comparison to other industries that have been grappling with these issues for a long time. If you think about maybe the film industry, how long has it been since you've seen a blackface or yellowface production? It's been quite some time now. In our industry, even grappling with the idea of leaving these traditions behind is contentious. If you want to Google that, there was a production in Europe of Aida that was dealing with blackface a summer or two ago. And this comes up over and over again in our industry and art form. So I think that it's really important to recognize that this conversation even happening here today is a step forward. We may be many steps behind others in this work as an industry, but having been someone working in opera, I can honestly say this is the first time I've been invited to speak on a panel about my experience as an Asian identifying artist. So I think that that is a small step into the community. And I hope that we continue that forward progress.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that question in particular?
I think the challenge, completely acknowledge the challenge that is being discussed here. And then having to sit on the other side of that as a leader of an arts organization, an opera company, and say, we have some great works of art, great works of musical art out there, whether it's Butterfly or Turandot, or we could even get into Pearl Fishers is another example, where these are wonderful musical pieces. And how do they survive in the world going forward? That's the big question that I certainly grapple with as a leader and somebody that deals with the programming side of things. But I know it's a conversation that's happening quietly, I would say, in our industry amongst general directors and artistic types. Is these are great works of art that, to be honest with you, Turandot and Butterfly are two of the top-selling operas in our industry. And they are the moneymakers. It's kind of like the ballet's Nutcracker. It tends to pay for the rest of the season in so many ways. And so how do we continue to honor the composer, the musical aspects of these things, yet not give them up in some way? But how do we make these things work in this incredible world we do live in now, where we can have conversations like this? I think that's the friction or the tug, a little bit of a tug of war, you might say, there.
And Greg, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that is one of the difficult questions we're grappling with today, right? These are some great works of art. How do we balance that? Can we judge arts from back then with the moral of today? One thing that I will add is that I think when we discuss great works of art, we often don't talk about the actual harm and trauma that it caused the community. So an example is that I think a few years ago, maybe it was last year, maybe it was a few years ago, time's a little bit iffy for me at this point, but DCPA produced the musical Miss Saigon. That is a very problematic musical. They had community panel like this, where they invited leaders from the Vietnamese community to come, give presentation, talk, invited the leaders to attend the musical. What I don't think people realize is that halfway through the musical, the leaders left crying because it triggered a lot of trauma and pain, seeing how their community, how their history, how their people are portrayed by the Western media. And that is, I think, a question we all have to grapple. I mean, you can definitely enjoy great works of art. We're not saying that you are terrible people. But I think if you enjoy it without critical examination or critical pushback of what kind of harm the arts is causing, then you're doing yourself a disservice, also doing the arts a disservice as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important to engage the community that's at issue. So, and I think Opera Colorado is doing that really well. But going out and asking, the APA community what exactly they would like to see out of this production, what are some concerns they have, I think is really important first step. And so I think we're doing that today.
So I want to just talk about how Opera Colorado is creating a sense of belonging for members of the AAPI community as we go into this production in May. Are there any things particular in mind that you'd like to share?
Well, this is the start. Obviously, being able to sit here and talk about difficult things, challenging subject matter, and have an honest discussion about it is the first step in the process. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in the evening, I just came from a DEI committee meeting that's made up of our board members and our staff, and we're just getting to that point of having a list of priorities and being able to start getting some strategies around those priorities, starting to be able to reach out into the community so that they can be part of that strategizing process. And so forth. So there's, I wish I could say here, here's the list of all these things that we're ready to do or ready to launch. We're not ready yet, and we fully acknowledge that. But we are taking all the steps to make sure that we are ready to do that work. I quite often get asked, well, why aren't you putting some of the new operas on? And this relates to particularly the Black community, where there's a lot of new work being written right now and getting a lot of great attention at the Met and other major opera companies. Why are we not putting that on the stage? Or why are we not doing something for the AAIP community specifically, or the Hispanic or Latino community? And I truly believe you can't just put something up on the stage and assume people will come and engage with it. You have to come to their community, you have to have a conversation, you have to find out what their interests are, what they want. And maybe that starts with our smaller community engagement programs that are out in the community to show a little bit of how we can collaborate and interact and support each other in some way. And hopefully over a period of time, that leads people to feel comfortable coming down to the Opera House and being part of something bigger than we can do in a small community venue. So that's kind of where we're heading right now. And I think it's an exciting time for the company and for what we can accomplish. And the overarching aspect of our DEI work is that we want to be a better citizen of opera in our community. And we want to be more of our community, instead of being on the fringe, you might say, of the community.
I'd love to hear from anyone on the panel some thoughts about what Opera Colorado can do, if you have any suggestions or considerations.
I would say, definitely supporting some of the API causes, bringing some attention to some of the issues that we're facing today. There's been a staggering increase in anti-Asian hate and incidents. You have a great audience, so I think just bringing to light these issues, encouraging folks to support these causes, and trying to encourage support of API actors and actresses in the space.
I think cross-promotion of some of the rich arts events that are going on within the AAPI community. I think there would be some shared interests between Opera Colorado's audience and some of the artistic projects happening in the community. For example, some people may be familiar with Colorado Dragon Boat Festival, but they may be less familiar with the fact that they have a film festival that will be launching pretty soon. And I think that there are a number of pieces there that would be of interest to standard opera goers. And yeah, I think just knowing about what's going on artistically and supporting that is a great step forward to grow some relationship and trust, because I think that's what you were alluding to, Greg. Like, we have to build from somewhere, and I think it's really important to recognize that we can't just put on a show and expect people will be interested in that show and come to it. So, yeah, that's what's on my mind.
I mean, I'm from Toronto. I'm a guest in this community. And I think actually our community members have a better sense of what the community needs. So I'd like to give that to Harry.
And what I would add to what excellent suggestions that Deborah and Meg already said is that my ask and how Opera Colorado or any other performing arts can be better partner to our community is that by supporting the existing arts group that is in the community. These are groups like Japanese Arts Network that Meg is a part of, or Inside Collab Theater. These are groups that are led by women of color, and they tell stories of the community written by community members. And I think that's a great way of building relationship and trust with the community, because now you're giving resources and support to the community to tell their own story, as opposed to relying to a fantasy version of the community told by somebody else.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. We have a little bit of time. Yes, Sarah will bring you the microphone.
Hi, I'm Mary Lee Chin, and you had a couple of questions of what you can do. I think one of the important things is to start with yourself, and for you and your board and your staff to get some diversity training where you learn about the different cultures and humility. You know, nobody wants to say that we're racist, but there is always some unknown bias that we all have. And unless we recognize it, it's really difficult to understand where a different culture is coming from, particularly the minority cultures. The other thing that you asked was, what is the impact on the community? And it is the perpetrating stereotypes of the dragon lady. I believe there are also characters, like one is named Pong, and what are the other two?
Pang and Pong.
That is so reminiscent of the taunting that I received. And so when you have things like that, it really is a negative impact on the community.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Ronald Lotzka, and I'm on the board of Opera Colorado. And I'd like to ask the panelists how they feel about Asian performers being restricted to performing only Asian roles. Should they be able to perform a role where they're cast as an Italian or someone who's French or German, or in a Porgy and Bess production?
Hey, Ron. Well, I can speak for myself. I'm a young director in the opera industry, and I will tell you that I am almost exclusively offered butterflies and Turandots. In fact, I just recently finished directing A Midsummer Night's Dream for Vancouver Opera, and I was shocked when I got that offer and it wasn't a butterfly. That's just something that I'm experiencing right now. I think there is a bit of a risk of conflating the aesthetic issues and philosophical issues of casting an opera with the political issues in opera. So, for example, the aesthetic issue would be, is it okay for someone of a particular cultural background or race to portray anyone else, just as sort of a neutral point? And I think we can get really into the weeds of discussing those issues. I think where it comes to some of these issues, Porgy and Bess being a good example, what we're talking about is people who have difficulty accessing people who face barriers accessing opportunities in general in our industry. So singers, IBPOC, BIPOC singers face invisible barriers and hurdles to accessing the similar opportunities across the board. And when they're pigeonholed into these pieces, they are quite limited in what they're able to do. Our white colleagues don't necessarily face those same barriers to forwarding their own careers. And so I think that's why there is, in this day and age, a need to both protect the opportunities that we are sort of able to protect and also encourage more diverse casting across the board. And I think once we see more diverse casting across the board, we might feel differently about the pieces that concern our community, or maybe not. But certainly at this point where I take, the sum total of casting across the industry and see very little diversity, I feel very hard-pressed to engage in philosophical debates sometimes over the political ones in this space.
I'd like to mention on top of that, I think one of the challenges we face in the industry, not just as a company, but as an industry, is around this issue, is when we put that APB out, you might say for singers for specific roles, quite often agents don't put forward people of color for a lot of white roles because they are just constantly pushing them into, particularly black singers, into Porgy and Bess and some of the newer work, of course, that's being written now specifically for that community. And so I think there's some systematic things that need to be addressed in our industry that we can start pushing towards as a company, but we can't do it ourselves. It has to come from much deeper into the industry itself. I know I've spoken to a lot of black singers who say, I had no idea you had auditions in New York. My agent never told me. Things of that nature. So we have to deal with things at that level too.
Meg, do you have some?
Well, I just wanted to recognize the fact that in order for these singers to get to the level of a New York audition, there's so much training and expense involved in that. And many of our great BIPOC talents don't come into the professional field for a variety of reasons. And then those who do have difficulties in networking and connecting. I personally have known a lot of difficulty for singers to get agents or to feel supported by them. So I think it is a real issue. I think our system needs to be changed or broken and rebuilt. And I think that we want to have a more equitable space that can truly be inclusive of a lot of different art makers. And it just, unfortunately, traditionally has not been possible in our art form.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
This is for Aria and Maggie. Is there anything egregious in Turandot, in stereotype or portrayal? Or is it just the cultural aspect of it?
Certainly, I think we heard of two great examples: the portrayal of the Dragon Lady and Turandot being portraying that caricature, and then these three characters, Ping Pang Pong, who are often portrayed as buffoon characters. They're I think the two main standouts that happen in this opera. And then I'll add, I think particularly important in today's day and age, there is the depicted suicide of an Asian woman. and in a day when we're seeing increased violence against AAPI individuals, and particularly something that is very close to my heart as I look at these works, what happened in Georgia a few years ago. I think that is particularly triggering to our community as well, just the violence against Asian women in these two works.
Any other thoughts? Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? I have a question. I've been thinking about, just listening to the conversation, thinking about costumes, and even what we saw earlier was a little discombobulating for me as a Japanese American. So you have different costumes, and I'm just wondering if you can say a few things about that.
Share this with Aria. There's some things that I chose this production partly because there are so many productions out there that are just over the top that you can't hear the music for the production, you might say. If you've ever seen the production at the Metropolitan Opera, you have to wear a pair of sunglasses, the bling and the mylar and the gold, and everything is just so, that's what it's all about at that point, is the set. There's another production that I looked at that came out back in 2010 by a relatively famous duo, Renaud Doucet and André Barbet, French director and designer, that was so, to be honest with you, so offensive to me. The way Ping Pang and Pong were played in a pair of polka dotted boxer shorts running around the stage was just ridiculous. It was awful. And so that was definitely not an option. What we talked to Aria ultimately about is this production that just has the dragon on the stage and stripping out some of the other elements that are actually quite old and getting a little frayed in the production, and trying to create a little bit more of an open environment to then tell the story that Aria wants to tell on this. The original costumes, which I wore, were very offensive, to be honest with you. And so I knew we couldn't use those. Santa Fe Opera several years ago did a new production down there that took more of this fantasy approach to it. And we said, well, that is a step in the right direction. Is it 100% where we need to be? Potentially, maybe not. But it was a step in the right direction to soften some of that insensitive aspects of Turandot.
Did you have anything to add?
No, I think that's well put. We're it's particularly, I am taking this very seriously and trying to figure out. I've inherited a lot with this production, but I think I'm putting my mind to figuring out how to make an incisive intervention if that's possible with the constraints that we've been given, and then also sort of to minimize the harm. And I think these costumes that were chosen certainly pull away from, make it less specific, make it feel less specific and targeted, I guess is the way to put it, while still acknowledging that we're leaning into a fantasy world that is also, as Harry points out, not necessarily the best, not necessarily a fix, if that's the best way to put it.
And what I will add is that Turandot was not allowed to be played in China for decades because it was deemed to be very offensive to the government and to the people. It was not played in China until 1995, and even then, the story was changed and the location was changed to Central Asia because the government doesn't want it to be tied to China. So, if there's a questions regarding whether the play is offensive or not, you could literally ask the country that it's based from whether it's offensive.
Thank you. I feel like you could drop the mic. So I think that will wrap us up for the evening. We do have a reception, some light snacks and drinks in our lobby, and so we'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you all for being here, and thank our panelists for your time, your heart, vulnerability, and honesty. Have a good evening.